The Marvel Cinematic Universe, a film franchise that was kicked off by Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man 1 in 2008, and in December of 2021 released its 27th film, Spider-Man No Way Home. The DC Extended Universe kicked off in 2013 with Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, and in 2021 released its 11th film with James Gunn's The Suicide Squad. Today, we discuss the real reason as to why the MCU succeeded and why the DCEU has forever been in their shadow. To explain why one succeeded where the other failed, we need to take out personal opinion from the picture. This video is not based on my opinion of each franchise or the films attached to them. This explanation is purely based on simple evidence and research about both fandoms. By the time Man of Steel was released, Marvel had 7 films attached to their cinematic universe, including one Avengers film. This already put pressure on Warner Bros. And DC, who were just about to dip their foot into the cinematic universe pool. 3 years later, DC's second film would be released, the sequel to Man of Steel, titled Batman v Superman. In that time, 5 more Marvel films were released, and a month after Batman v Superman, Captain America's Civil War came out. So you can understand the pressure and eagerness Warner Bros. Had to start increasing their roster for the DCEU. But that would be their downfall. If we accelerate to 2022, Marvel has 27 films in 14 years, and DC have 11 films in 9 years, one of those being a Justice League studio cut and another being a Justice League director's cut. If you picked out 5 films from the MCU at random, there will be a clear pattern. You feel the consistency in tone, in quality, and the overall viewing experience is very similar. If you were to do the same with the DCEU, you wouldn't experience the same feeling of consistency. And that's one of the reasons as to why the MCU is so far ahead of the DCEU. No matter what characters they use, no matter when the films were set, the films were consistent. They stuck to a plan and audiences fell in love with it. Now for comic book fans, yes, the constant shift in tone of the DCEU can be enjoyable, but for general audiences who are the make or break for big blockbuster films are a huge factor to consider. Consumers love consistency. They want to be able to trust the brand they are investing in. If a company is constantly changing their mind and shifting between different stories and tones, general audiences cannot trust that franchise. The MCU had a plan. They had an idea to build up towards Thanos whilst bringing in other Marvel characters and expanding the universe. Kevin Feige helped manage that to make sure that they felt all connected, and so it became a successful universe, with general audiences and Marvel comic fans alike all falling in love with the universe because they knew they could trust Marvel's films. The DCEU, on the other hand, started off with a plan but didn't follow through with it. No matter what you think of Zack Snyder, Warner Bros. Hired him and asked him to create an accelerated plan for the DCEU, where other storytellers could build off of it, but mainly because they wanted to catch up to Marvel. After just 4 films in the DCEU, Warner Bros. Changed their mind and decided to try and copy the Marvel tone, bringing in Joss Whedon to reshoot Justice League after Zack Snyder left the project due to his daughter passing away. This was the beginning of the downfall for the DCEU. Whatever general audiences had begun to get used to with the DCEU had been thrown out of the window when Justice League came around. A complete 180 in terms of tone, storytelling, and the overall aesthetic of the universe, and this was where audiences began to detach themselves from the DC Extended Universe. And like I said before, consumers want consistency. They want to be able to trust a brand and to know what they are getting in the next film. The MCU also had rough patches, just like the DCEU. Some of their box office numbers weren't the greatest at the start, but the difference is the studio had faith in those creating the universe. They allowed them to learn, to adapt, and to improve the overall universe, whereas the DCEU expected peak MCU box office numbers without laying down the foundations of their cinematic universe, and at the first sign of danger, they jumped ship, deciding to go in a completely different direction as to what the first 4 films had set up. Not only did that confuse the general audience, but it also alienated DC fans who were enjoying this new take on the superhero genre. Studio interference is also a big factor to consider when comparing the cinematic universes. 3 out of the 5 DCEU films were tampered with by Warner Brothers. Batman v Superman had 30 minutes cut out and was re-edited by the studio. Suicide Squad was rewritten and reshot because the studio wanted the film to be like Deadpool, and Justice League was heavily reshot, and the Snyder Cut is all the evidence you need to see what they changed. The key point is that the MCU stuck to their plan. They had faith in their creatives, and because audiences could see a pattern that they liked, they were able to get comfortable and be excited for each Marvel movie coming out, slowly building a huge following and a fandom that was mainly united. Now, I know that social media doesn't reflect an entire fandom, but it is a good way to see what fans are thinking. Just comparing the number of followers each company has, you can clearly see that the MCU is far more popular than the DCEU. If you look at the comments of MCU posts and DCEU posts, they are also completely different. MCU comments are filled with excitement or discussing when the next trailer is coming out, or even who their favourite Spider-Man is. DCEU comments are arguing about which DC film is better, or why one storyline should die and another should carry on, or even who is playing Superman. There's such a contrast in the fandoms that makes me so grateful to be a huge fan of both, because I can watch DC films but also interact with MCU fans who seem to be far more united. This next part is more of my own personal opinion, but I think it is still very valid. The Marvel Cinematic Universe made every film feel important. It made them feel connected. Like you had to watch every film no matter how unknown the character was, because not only did you trust the company in delivering the film in a certain way, but because you knew that this film was significant in some way to the future of the universe. It's like every film is a chapter in the book of the MCU. The DCEU started the same way. It created a promise to their audience that these characters lived in the same universe, and that every film was connected. But the inconsistency in tone and the confusion as to what is connected to what led fans and general audiences to feel disconnected to the universe, as the studio had pretty much created a war between fans. Those who liked one mindset for the DCEU and one that liked a different mindset of the DCEU, because the studio had teased fans with both, without sticking to one. Imagine if after the first Avengers film, the MCU decided to go really dark and serious, a complete 180 in the established tone of their cinematic universe. It would feel confusing, right? You wouldn't have the same fan investment for the franchise because what you began to love and get used to has been completely changed. Now, I'm not saying a dark and serious tone is bad, and I'm not saying a bright and comedic tone is bad either. I'm just saying that when you establish a consistent tone for a franchise of films and then completely change that tone, your audience will either adapt or reject it. Now, the reason why some people, like the Restore the Snyderverse fandom, are rejecting the new DCEU is because the studio took away what they loved most about the DC Extended Universe. The story created and the tone that was set was what those fans became loyal to in the DCEU, and it's a false promise created by Warner Brothers who allowed the early DC films to hint at something more, setting up a deeper story, one that Warner Brothers themselves threw away. For us MCU fans, it would be like Marvel creating Avengers 1, us seeing Thanos in his chair, and then Marvel completely forgetting that storyline and going down a different path. A false promise created by the studio themselves is why the DCEU is so far behind. Their fandom is divided because they created a franchise where different stories and tones were being told at the same time, where general audiences couldn't find a consistent feeling to the DCEU, and where fans are at war with each other because they constantly argue about which director is best or what storyline is best. The biggest mistake the DCEU did was setting DC fans against each other. They gave them multiple options instead of choosing one tone from the start and sticking with it. Sometimes a lot of options is a bad thing. I think the same thing would have happened with the MCU too. If the MCU, 5 movies in, decided to completely change the mindset and the tone of their universe, then I think they too would have fans who wouldn't move on, and fans who preferred the new tone. Whereas the MCU sticking to the established tone meant fans had no choice but to watch this version of Marvel characters, because there was no alternative to compare it to. When looking at why the MCU is such a huge success, and why the DCEU is in its shadow, there is really only one factor that affects it all, and that is consistency. If you don't have a consistent franchise, general audiences and fans will lose interest and trust in that franchise. It doesn't matter whether you think certain DC films are good or bad, it simply comes down to the fact if you don't have consistency, you can't expect a large, long-term, loyal fan base. If the DCEU had stuck to the same tone and story from the start, then I think their fan base would be united, and the franchise would have been far more successful. I also think if they had the same tone as the MCU from the start, then the fandom would also be united, and their universe would have also been a success. Whatever they decided to do, as long as their tone and story were consistent, I believe the success would follow, because consumers like consistency. And if you want a loyal fan base that can grow as you create more films, then you need consistency, and to build the trust between company and consumer. When you look at everything that has gone wrong in the DCEU and everything that has gone right for the MCU, there is one undeniable factor. The studio behind the films have been the difference. On one side, you have Marvel. They put Kevin Feige in charge, who took time developing their universe, was patient with the films they created, learned from past errors but didn't jump ship, and most importantly, cared about their fans. Warner Brothers, on the other hand, rushed their universe, tried to catch up to Marvel without doing the proper research as to why they were successful, micromanaged all their early films, alienated actors, directors, and fans, jumped ship at the first sign of trouble instead of taking their time to create a long-term plan, and are now very far behind the MCU. In conclusion, the real reason why the DCEU is in the MCU's shadow is because of a lack of consistency. There are many other smaller factors all leading back to the way both franchises are run, but the main reason why the DCEU hasn't had the same success as the MCU is because they were never able to hold on to the general audience because of their lack of consistency. Personally, I love both universes. I prefer some films to others, but overall, I'm a Marvel and DC fan who just wants what is best for the fans. Hopefully, the DCEU can improve under the Discovery merger and utilise the DC multiverse to create the best franchise it can be. Make sure to let me know what you think the MCU has done so well and why the DCEU has done so poorly in comparison in the comments below. But that is all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe and turn on post notifications so you never miss a video. I hope to see you here again soon, so until then, have a great day. Bye!